So welcome today to our panel discussion on affordable housing development. In this panel, I would like to set our frame in equitable development, namely development and pre-development processes, ranging from land use guiding to financing and occupancy, that we are building communities in such a way that they meet the needs of low-income residents in our communities and in the broader region. The AICP Code of Ethics calls planners to do better. I'm quoting it here. We shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs. We, as planners, have an unambiguous ethical responsibility to alleviate inequities and prioritize the needs of communities that are negatively impacted by historic and contemporary discrimination. There are a few different principles of equitable development, but centrally the focus is around power and transparency. Who is making decisions and who understands the impact? How did the process of development involve the local community members most affected by the development project, especially low wealth people, people of color, neighborhood groups, community organizations, people living with disabilities, and new immigrants to our nation? In that spirit, I'm going to ask you as panelists to answer your questions today, considering the lens of who was involved and who benefits from each development. I encourage you to connect your stories to the residents that live in the properties we're discussing today. If you know what jobs they have, number of families that live there, is there turnover at these properties, or are there issues between neighbors? Are residents moving in here to stay, or are they moving closer to jobs that are currently held in your community? So, if everyone has heard me, I've been looking away from my screen for a moment. We're going to start off with a question for Carl, and I welcome David Wellington to jump into and answer this, as you have a development relationship going back. Some communities haven't had the staff time or prior political support until recently to work on forming relationships with developers of affordable housing. So how did your development relationship form? What have you done to build and nurture trust in your relationship? What are your relationship with residents during pre-development? And how do you build trust between everybody, between city staff, between the developer, and between the residents of the community? Thank you so much.
Maybe I can take that one first. And for those of us on the panel or on the listening in who I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Carl Batalden, and I'm the City of Woodbury's Housing and Economic Development Manager. Jeff Von Felt, who I think we're still trying to get back online, is from Duffy Development, and Duffy in the city, or I should say Duffy has 3 affordable housing projects in Woodbury, and we're very happy to have them. And I think the question goes back to sort of how did it get started and how did we build trust? And I always like to encourage people just kind of go back to the basics, good communication, and actually listen to people. Don't, have that sense of authenticity. When you go to a meeting or a community meeting and you're taking feedback, do something with the feedback or tell the residents how you're going to handle the feedback. And oftentimes we've seen projects where an actual site plan is going to be amended based on feedback. I remember one affordable housing project we did with Common Bond. The building was going to be orientated one way, and then based on neighborhood feedback, we turned the shape of the building 90 degrees. And then that's what the neighborhood wanted. So I think part of it is just, it's that being open to communication and being honest. And if you can't do something, let people know why. Provide the context. Don't just say no. Say, well, that can't be done because of X, Y, and Z. So really, again, for me, it's go back to the basics. Be courteous, communicate, listen, and to the extent possible, either implement the feedback or tell people why you can't.
Yeah, just to build on that, this is David Wellington. I'm president and co-owner of Wellington Management. We are a commercial and residential management company, and we do quite a bit of development work as well. We developed several retail properties on the eastern side of Woodbury off of Radio Drive in the 1990s. Obviously, I didn't do that personally. That was Steve, my dad. Maybe it's not obvious. Maybe I look really old. That would be good. At any rate, we have, I think, 13 buildings in Woodbury, but we haven't done any recent development work within the last 5 or 10 years, though we have, in Woodbury, we have done quite a bit of development work elsewhere. I would echo what Carl's saying. You know, in a variety of communities where we are doing affordable housing development work, it's important for us to get to a neighborhood organization or to a community organization on the front end to try to solicit feedback before we've done a bunch of design work. And frankly, we make an effort to try to talk to the elected officials who officially represent a constituency that we're effectively going to build into. And so trying to understand specific hot button issues that may vary pretty drastically from community to community, or, you know, speak directly with neighbors that are going to be physically engaged with the real estate on a day-to-day basis. We're long-term owners of real estate, and so we build and hold, or buy and hold, and so that does invariably kind of shift the incentive structure for us to ensure that we're good long-term community partners and really do try to solicit feedback and listen to it carefully to understand, you know, how we can respond to it in an effective manner to make our projects better.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of follow-up questions. What are some of the beginning steps of affordable housing developments in your community? Who reaches out and says hello first? Do you have a site for development and field market rate and affordable projects for the same site? Do you work with affordable housing developers to find the right site? What kind of comes first, or is it different in different situations?
Let me take that one, because I think it's a really important question. And, you know, let's be honest, different cities have different approaches to how they coordinate the development in their community. But I think, again, it's as early as possible to get together and sit down and talk through the concept, because you know, what I always want to hear from developers who are coming in, frankly, whether it's for affordable housing or anything, is what are you good at? What are you trying to achieve? What's your dream scenario? Instead of having a developer come to me and say, hey, I need 7.5 acres. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Let's talk about what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes you might think you need 7.5 acres, but there's an opportunity through, you know, whether it's a planned unit development or a master plan or something where you can build the same project, but you can get it done in 5 acres or something like that. So I think, again, the key is have those early conversations. Don't, you know, civil engineers and architects cost a lot of money. And I don't want a developer or a builder to go and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on plan sets and architectural stuff if they're like fundamentally flawed. So, but I think it's also that commitment, like I said earlier, be honest, you know, and have that good back and forth about what are you trying to achieve, and that likely is going to lead to better outcomes.
Thank you, Carl. Jeff, I know you just joined us. Would you like to take just a moment to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how your development relationship formed with the city of Woodbury or any other communities that you're working in the Metro?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jeff Von Felt. I'm with Duffy Development, and we are primarily an affordable housing developer here in the Twin Cities. And I know I did hear Carl introduce me earlier, but then I lost everything, so I'm not sure what happened after that. But I know you're talking about relationship with cities and the neighborhood around. So if I use Woodbury as an example, our first development was in about the year 2001 when we finished it, but the work to get that project online started much earlier, in the late, I'm going to say 1998 kind of time frame. And you know, how did we introduce ourselves to the city? And this idea was really what Carl was just talking about, is, you know, going into the city, talking about the site, seeing if it's realistic, trying to find out if the city even has an interest in providing affordable housing. I mean, that's kind of a big step to get passed. And then also at the same time, kind of trying to feel out the city staff about how their city leaders are thinking about affordable housing. And so the first development in Woodbury, was a great case study because it was the type of thing where without the city staff leadership and the majority of the city council leadership, the development wouldn't have happened. The city staff was in favor of it, strongly supported just a small development, 34 units at the time. But it was in the kind of attached to an existing neighborhood, and there was a lot of neighborhood opposition. Council chambers were full at most meetings, and not many in favor of us. So the leadership of the city has to be there to take on this stuff. And thankfully, I would say my experience, in the last number of years is that most city staff understand the need for affordable housing and kind of take that role seriously and push their councils and planning commission members on supporting it as well. So that's kind of the initial meetings that take place, is just trying to find out where the city's at.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate that. Allison, I know we haven't brought you into the conversation yet, so I have a question for you. You have a unique relationship with funding. You work for Carver County, and you both apply for funding and tax credits for your process and projects, and you also disperse awards for other development partners. So I'd like you to share how you identify what funding sources you're going to use for your development and what your relationship is like with communities when they're applying for funds.
Sure. So thanks, Hillary. My name is Allison Strike. I'm the Deputy Director for Carver County Community Development Agency. So we're a public entity. And we own and manage just shy of 700 units across the county. So we work very closely not only with the county itself, but with the 11 cities and then the multiple townships within the county. So we've utilized multiple funding sources in the past. The bulk of our projects are funded through general obligation bonds, either at the city or county level, or sometimes we use the city and roll into the county GO bond. We had a HUD-backed mortgage on a property which we recently refinanced and moved it to a general obligation bond. We had a Minnesota housing mortgage and a HUD risk share on a project-based Section 8 building that we owned. And then our newest development, which I'll probably reference quite a bit during our discussion, is a low-income housing tax credit project. So for most of our projects, we start with the feasibility. We almost always start with the general obligation bonds as the funding mechanism. Just because of the interest rate we're able to get and the funding structure, it allows us to fund everything under just that one structure. And then if that's not an option, we look at what our other options, may be, which is why we've had, like the HUD risk share or our current projects is the low income housing tax credit. And so we work really hard to maintain really good relationships with the cities, townships, and the counties. We administer a grant program. It's called the Community Growth Partnership Initiative, and cities can apply for funding. And one of the eligible uses of that funding, they can do pre-development and redevelopment, but one of the eligible uses is for affordable housing. And that program started in 2016. So we've been actively promoting that with the cities, having discussions with the cities. And then an example of a recent project that was funded through the initiative is a senior project in the city of Chanhassen, which is currently under development. And so we awarded the city a grant towards that project, and then the city is providing TIF, and there'll be approximately 50 units of affordable senior housing in the total development.
Thank you for some of those examples. I think it helps communities to hear what types of groups are served by affordable housing development and noting what tools are at the disposal of local communities to use, which is a great segue into my next bundle of questions about development process and community needs. So broader than just the need for affordable housing, and this question is open to anybody who wants to answer it, What have you done within your community to identify how to meet community needs? Perhaps this came up in community outreach or listening sessions in response to people petitioning elected officials, or it may have taken the form of a design feature the size of the unit. So, Carl, you touched on this a little bit earlier, where just rotation of the building was enough to bring people on board for a project. But I'm wondering if there's any other examples that you would like to share.
Yeah. Yeah, I do have a few things. And again, a lot of it has to do with that communication piece. And I think Woodbury is known for its planning. And a part of planning is communicating out. And I think of a project where ultimately Common Bond built a 45-unit affordable rental project in our city. We had known for quite some time the location where the building was going to go, but because our HRA owned the land, we didn't know what was going to be built or who was going to be built. So we put a sign on the physical land that neighbors could see, and it said, future affordable housing site with questions, call Carl. So that then when we went through that RFP process and there was a development, hopefully there were fewer people taken by surprise, or if someone was taken by surprise, at least you could go back to them and say, hey, well, we've had that sign there for a long time, and that it shows good faith, that we weren't somehow like springing something on folks. And I think that really speaks to what I'm quite passionate about, frankly, is the implementation of comprehensive plans. In the 7-county metro area, all cities are sort of always working at some point on their comprehensive plan. Maybe you're updating the plan, or maybe you're at that part of the decade where you're implementing it. But one of the first things we always do when we're done with our comp plan, we create then a housing action plan. And that's an adopted document from the city council that identifies what are your priorities for the decade. And so I really think that goes so far to set the stage for what is the community going to be doing? And then when you get that question 3 or 4 years later about, wow, this is really surprising to me, what's the plan? And I was like, well, no, this is the plan. It's just now we're implementing what we said we were going to do.
Yeah, and if this is Jeff, just can I follow up on that a little bit? Okay, so one of the other things I think that is really helpful for cities, kind of going back on that topic of, I don't know if convincing is the right word, but getting your city leaders on board with the need for affordable housing is to really have the city do a comprehensive housing study. Mm-hmm. It's an invaluable tool for the staff, but it's also an invaluable tool for anybody that is interested in not only affordable housing, but learning more about the market rate levels or the senior housing. When you do a comprehensive housing study, you're going to incorporate all of that stuff. And that's a tool that is really informative, but it is also one of those tools that staff and then if in fact it comes out and says, there's a need for affordable housing, it's a tool that you can take to your city council and your planning commission and report the information. We do those housing studies ourselves, but it's not the same as the city staff doing it. And so, as an example, just recently, in the last couple of years, we went before our city to get approval of a site to do an affordable housing development on, and they didn't quite have the housing study done. So even though our studies showed a need, the city staff was well aware of the need. There was a housing study that was in the works and wasn't quite done, and our timing to get an application in for funding was before that. So the project, was denied by the city council at that time, and then we have to wait another year. And now that another year comes around, the housing study is complete, the evidence is there, and pretty much the same city council approved the development. So. Those types of tools are really, really important.
If I can really underscore what Jeff just said, I mean, we live in a world that wants data, and I get requests from my public officials to make an evidence-based decision, so having, especially when it comes to housing, frankly, whether it's affordable or market rate, you really want to be able to demonstrate that need is there, and that really goes a long way. And I think one of the tools that we've seen then at the neighborhood level, especially with tax credit developments, is we'll have that first slide at a neighborhood meeting saying, hey, this is a tax credit project. Here's what the rents are going to be. And what I've noticed in the past 3 or 4 affordable projects that have come to Woodbury, there have been some folks in the audience that I felt maybe were a little skeptical of the project. And then when they see what the rents are going to be, all of a sudden they're supportive of like, oh yeah, I get it. Like that's a community need. And I think that speaks to not only the communication piece, but then also, like Jeff is saying, to have that data and have that evaluative component.
I would add that having a clear grasp and understanding of the infrastructure that's in place or the infrastructure needs that may need to be put in place on the front end for particularly for higher density affordable housing projects is a pretty important piece of the puzzle, and often gets pushed back and forth between the developer and the local municipality or community to try to assign that liability, financial liability, and it's can be a really big number, particularly given where construction costs are currently. And I'm speaking on a call with Met Council. I mean, sewer, sanitary capacity, utility capacity is a really important piece of this, as well as roads and transit. We found a modicum of success in engaging in a participatory manner, particularly with the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, with their economic development agencies, and participating alongside them and kind of being contract economic development agents with them in low to moderate income communities, in particular in North Minneapolis, where we're working on 7 blocks of property, 10-acre site in the Bass Creek Valley area, just north of 394. And there's a huge need for infrastructure improvements, sanitary utilities, contamination. Obviously, there's quite a bit of contamination on the ground. And trying to get all that out in the open on the front end and get champions to be able to find those dollars to make those needed improvements is a really big piece of it.
Hillary, I'll add a quick couple examples from the CDA perspective. So I mentioned our current development under construction, Trails Edge South. It's in the city of Waconia. It's 60 units of low-income housing tax credit, general occupancy. So that project, how that project came to be, it was part of a planned community development that the city of Waconia approved back in 2011. That included affordable housing, retail, single-family row homes, and then a new school. And so, here we are 10 years later, kind of on the few remaining pieces of that planned community development that includes some retail, and then our last 2 parcels, the rest of it's been built out. And so the city has been super supportive over these 10 years of, as we've tried to look at the feasibility in all the different ways, we've tried to get it funded. And then, just to some of our work with the cities and determining that need. So we have 2 different projects, one in the city of Waconia, one in the city of Norwood, where we had a joint powers agreement with the city and developed with the city. So we have 2 senior buildings. It's got the senior affordable housing, the city hall, a library, and then a satellite sheriff station within those buildings. And those have proved to be really successful, just, as far as our partnerships go with the cities and really addressing, a need for the affordable housing, and then sort of the city side with them needing new space for their city hall.
Can I add one thing too? I think, David addressed a really important point about sort of infrastructure and identifying what those needs are to make a development happen. Another challenge, because I don't want to be, 100% rosy and optimistic about everything, because affordable housing is hard and it's difficult to finance. And one of the challenges I think that's inherent to our system here in the Metro is, as part of the comprehensive plan decennial updates, cities are required to plan for affordable housing, which is good. But the way that we do that is we're required to have a certain number of acres that are guided at certain density levels so that there's a place for that affordable housing to go. And I think one of the things we've seen in the past few comp plan cycles is that then, the moment, even before adopting your comp plan, the moment you start having your community meetings about how your future land use map is going to change, and you identify, hey, there's an area that's shifting from low density to high residential, or maybe something's going mixed use where you could have an apartment building. The moment those maps are on a website, a real estate speculator buys them. And they buy them because they know that there's going to be a market for a future apartment building. And I think that can present then an inherent challenge for the affordable developers, because with the presence of that middleman who wants to make a profit, all of a sudden the land acquisition price just went up. And so I do think that that is one of the hurdles for affordable housing development, is finding access to land that is affordable when you're competing with market rate developers.
Thanks for those answers, y'all. In my next question, I'm going to kind of zoom in on one area of affordable housing. In our research of affordable housing development over the last planning decade, between 2011 and 2020, we found that the greatest unmet need for households was for those earning 30% of AMI and below. So for a family of four, that's roughly $30,000 a year. If you have successfully made some 30% AMI units, either in your community or in your development projects, what has been necessary in order to include some units that are affordable at 30% AMI? Were there funding tools? Were there special city powers that were used? What did you need to do in terms of garnering community support for these projects? I'm happy to open it up to anybody who is willing to answer that question.
I'll take a stab at it from the CDA. So we've gotten really creative over the years on working to address the needs of families that are below 30% of AMI. I'll go back to our newest project, Trails Edge South. Out of the 60 units, we'll have 8 units that will be using housing supports for supportive housing units, and then we got 8 units of project-based vouchers for Metro HRA. So all the housing supports will be 1 bedrooms. The project-based vouchers will be 2 bedrooms. At another development, we have 5 Section 811 units. If you're not familiar with Section 811, they're designated for 18 to 61 with a disability. And it's a project-based unit, like a PBRA through Minnesota Housing. And we anticipate applying for that again when Minnesota Housing releases that RFP. We have a little bit of a unique advantage at being a housing authority. We have 31 units of fair cloth, 31 fair cloth units. That means we have 31 units of public housing we can develop. And our intention is to, as it stands right now, we're working on 2 senior deals, and our intention is to split those 31 units up into those 2 senior deals to have some subsidized units. And then we've also applied for and been awarded. We have 62 units of project-based vouchers through Metro HRA, and those are scattered. We have project-based units in every one of our developments. So that has probably been our biggest tool, is trying to get project-based vouchers when they're available.
If I can comment, sure, great. So I don't know if the attendees are all from Minnesota or from elsewhere, but in Minnesota, actually, the main funder, the state agency, the Housing Finance Agency, really puts a priority on those families and individuals with incomes of 30%. So they really are asking the developers through their tax credit program to create housing that supports homeless families, persons with disabilities, and those at the lower spectrum of the income scale. And that's really hard to do and make a development work, especially in our case as a for-profit developer. We have a little bit different margins than nonprofits, but we are able to do that with the help of the housing tax credit program. It just takes, I guess what I want to say is that it takes a village. It takes kind of all of the players to be involved and committed. We need help from the cities usually, and this is financial help that we're talking about. Financial help through TIF financing or waivers of fees or something like that. The counties are typically involved with their programs that they might have available funds for the developments. Minnesota Housing has funds available for these developments. The developer has funds for the developments. And that's all got to come together. Met Council, let's not forget Met Council, has funds for the developments. And all of those have to kind of come together to create that housing for the very low income families. And mixing them in to developments is really seemingly the way to go. And it's also, it's kind of also, I think, the best way to spread that around the area, the metro area. So there's the lack of concentration. But it's also helpful, I think, when we go and talk to cities, and we're not shy about this. When we go and talk to cities about the developments we're putting in, we're very clear that this is going to include affordable units, with certain incomes that are much lower than others. This is going to include homeless families, and they sort of need to know what they're committing to when they commit, because again, at these city meetings, sometimes if there's opposition and somebody surprises a council member with information that they don't have, that's never a good thing. So, the developers should come in honestly with what their goal is and what they want to do. And quite frankly, if you want affordable housing in Minnesota, you're almost going to have to include these units in your development. It's a pointing system, and you can, play around with the points, but you are going to need these units. So to not communicate that to the city is, I think, detrimental to the project as a whole.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, just right on that. We have 2 projects right now that have 30% AMI units mixed in. That one of them we just delivered 2 months ago at University in Dale, the northwest corner of University in Dale and St. Paul, and then the other one in South Minneapolis at 32nd and Hiawatha. And then we have 2 more in the pipeline in Minneapolis that are going to have, I think, one project with 40 project-based vouchers through the Public Housing Authority, and then one with 17 units at 30%. And both of those are much larger projects, like in the 150 to 185 unit range. One of the things I do want to point out is that some of those units, particularly if they're long-term homeless, should come with associated services and a service provider. And so we have partnered with a variety of different service providers in those projects, and that's an ongoing need. And the integration with our management team and that service provider is really important, and it needs to be a working relationship that's ongoing and productive. And oftentimes the management team or those service providers are faced with some very significant and real challenges that those specific households are facing, and they have an impact not only on the units that they're in, but also the units around them. And so we take a very hands-on approach with regard to those units. And also it drives our management cost up a little bit. And so we're, in our future projects, are modeling higher management costs effectively on the salary side to ensure that we have enough staffing and we're not bankrupting the project due to the needs that are coming into the project. And so I just wanted to focus on that. And Jeff also, mentioned that it takes a village. Usually those projects have a stack 9 deep with regard to the capital stack coming into a project, and that's effectively the developers passing the hat around to try to get everybody engaged in the project. That also means that there's 9 attorneys on the closing conference call for 8 to 10 weeks ahead of that finance closing, and they're all kind of advocating strenuously for their clients to ensure that the policies are being met for the dollars that are coming in, and it creates a lot more churn and challenge to those projects to get across the line. So it's not for the faint of heart or folks that don't have a lot of patience and pragmatism when they're trying to get projects across the finish line.
I think that taking a village approach is correct, and I am thinking of a tax credit project we just closed on with Dominium, where I believe we had 7 separate applications to MMB for allocation of bonding authority to get the 4% credit to work. And it's just work that you have to do. But I guess a question I'd have for Dave and Jeff, I can totally see where to get those 30% units, obviously project-based vouchers, wonderful to have that subsidy ongoing into the future. I can see how HPH units scattered in there are going to help. But, Dave, you talked about if you're doing some homeless units, that probably needs to have some element of service coming with that. And, for a community like Woodbury, as we're developing, kind of pushing out our MUSA line, the areas where we have the greenfield development, does it matter from a geographical perspective, like where you put HPH units to get those services? Does it need to be more urban or along transit or, close to a shopping mall, or like, how does the geographic component overlay with that services component?
There is a correlation with the lower income units having less likelihood of vehicle as a part of their asset for their family or their household. And so having access to consistent transit is an important thing. But I think you were asking the question about services. The service providers tend to be driving around in cars. And so I don't know that there's a need on that side of it for the location to be close to a transit line. But certainly it's a benefit for many of the households that we're seeing on the 30% side to be close to transit.
Yeah, it's important that, well, I think you take that all into account because what from the developer standpoint, what you're trying to develop and who you're going to serve. And so in general, I would say that you want to be able to be close to transit, close to jobs, not too far away from things. Now, on the other hand, sometimes you kind of, I relate it to like when churches pick new sites. You always see a church like way out in the middle of nowhere, and it's just there waiting for development to come to it. And sometimes that's what we we have to do too. If Sienna Ridge and Woodbury was really out on the fringes of Woodbury when we did it in 2009 or something like that.
Right.
And today there's an elementary school right next door, right across the street. And so planning for those things, you also have to be able to see a little bit out in the future. The city has to as well, to recognize that, yes, they will need some services, but those are coming, clearly coming that way. And so
in other words, for the suburban edge communities of the world, we shouldn't be afraid to put affordable housing complexes that are, closer to the MUSA line, further away from the core, because you're anticipating the growth of the community.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally, as long as the city sees the growth heading that way, I think that's a decent strategy. Now, the other trick is to convince Minnesota Housing, who controls the tax credits, that is a legitimate idea with their scoring criteria and their location, criteria. So that's a little hurdle that you sometimes have to get over.
Yeah, you've all made the point kind of separately that there are so many different pieces of work that need to happen, and authorities that need to agree, and funding sources that need to align in order for development to happen. I'm wondering if, in your experience with new affordable housing development, you've seen examples of when compromises have been made. We know that in any development process, not everything that we conceive at the outset ends up getting built, sometimes for the better and sometimes for worse. So I'm wondering what kind of compromises have been made in the developments that you've been talking about today, and who were they made for?
Well, on our most current development on Trails Edge, that project was initially planned to be 76 units. And so our compromise was made to get funded through Minnesota Housing. So I think, as Jeff and even David already alluded to, it's all about points and how you can play with the numbers. And when you get points for having, I don't even know, one of you can tell me the percentage, but 75% of your units are more 2 or bigger and 50% are 3 bedrooms. We had to reduce the number of units to really play with the points to, be successful at getting that project funded.
Yeah, I would say one of the big compromises is unit count, probably. Developers, we think we can put 100 units per acre on any site. Sometimes cities don't agree with that. So generally, you're working with the city and within their zoning codes to be able to meet each other's needs. At some points, the city is able to be flexible with a PUD or something like that and give a little bit on the number of units, maybe makes the project work just a little bit better because there's better economies of scales. Sometimes, though, they hold tight, and we come in with 100 units, but the city says no, we're just not going to allow it there, and then the developer becomes the flexible person in that realm. And so there's setback flexibility, there's density, there's a lot of different things that happen in discussions with the cities that, we're compromising all the time, right? So it's kind of a big element to all of this.
I think that density piece is really key. And, one of the things that we've done for a long time is through our comprehensive plan, anticipate the need for density bonuses for affordable housing. And I think sometimes people look at that in the abstract and think, well, what is 3 extra units per acre? What's that going to do? And I remember very clearly a project that came in on a 12-acre site, and I was like, well, we can do this, build 180 units, but that's going to create this big financial gap. How are you going to close the gap? I said, 12 acres, 3 extra units per acres, that's 36 additional units. That's extra net operating income. That closes the gap right there. And I guarantee you, if you drive by this 216 unit project today, if it had only been 180 units versus 216, you wouldn't know. And I think that's that's sometimes the eye of the beholder piece, that you can really get a little more density and the site can still make it work. Now, no 2 sites are the same. This is a particular site that transportation wise and infrastructure wise, it could accommodate that. But I would encourage anybody from a city perspective, consider taking a look at, next comp plan cycle, throw something in your housing chapter about density bonus. It's not a matter of right, the council still has to approve it. But it can be a powerful tool to closing that final gap. It's not the only tool, but it can do something.
I would just add to all of these statements that, I think most developers, if they have any sort of aesthetic vision, they probably don't like the similarity of the housing stock that is being built right now from an aesthetic perspective, and really the limited choices that we as developers are offered by the design world, which is really driven by cost. And it's not, I don't think anybody wants to throw up something exactly the same as something that's down the street. But that's really what, at the end of the day, the equation you have to solve for is whether or not you can get the project out of the ground and you're building high quality infrastructure for folks who need it. And, I think that there's frequently compromises from an aesthetic standpoint that we have to work through when we're trying to value engineer projects when we get our final construction numbers in, or we get big change orders from dirt or whatever that are very unpleasant, but it's a requirement of the job, and it's a piece of the responsibility that we have to as a fiduciary to the array of investors or folks that have dollars in our deals. And I think in a perfect world, we would be able to let the architects run wild with a variety of different materials and setbacks and design decisions that would really enhance the livability of projects. But that's not the world that we live in. And we have to be as efficient as possible with what we have and try to make small moves that really do have a big impact.
I think another thing that comes to mind, you ask about compromises. There's compromises at different points along the way. And, we haven't had a lot of neighborhood opposition for our immediate past few affordable deals. But, sometimes when you're working with a neighborhood, there can be a screening question, and you sometimes can win a neighborhood over by saying, instead of, 1 row of Black Hill spruce, I'll do 2 rows. you know, or plant an extra maple tree or do something with landscaping to provide that visual buffer or that screening. And I'm not trying to just spend Dave and Jeff's money because I know every tree costs what it costs. But in the grand scheme of things, sometimes if you're trying to get neighborhood buy-in, you know, the landscaping can play a role that at the end of the day is probably cheaper than some of the building material aesthetic things.
Thanks y'all for those answers. Really in-depth experiences that you guys have had with this. One of the submitted questions that we had during registration for this event was about mixed income development. So we talked a little bit earlier about ways that we can ensure that homes affordable to people earning 30% AMI in our region are being built. And you mentioned that many of these include a mixed income development where there are different levels of affordability within the same building. So do you think that there are ways that, or do you think that local communities are starting to hear differently what mixed income developments are and the assets that they bring to communities? How are you helping to kind of persuade decision makers that incorporating mixed income development is sort of the way to go?
And just to follow up, maybe, so when you're saying mixed income, are you suggesting that mixed meaning affordable units and then really affordable units, or market rate with affordable units being mixed?
Yeah, whether or not it includes market rate, I leave it as sort of agnostic.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally when you talk about mixed income developments, folks are kind of thinking about market rate units with some affordability included, and that, you know, that certainly can be done. We'll find out next week whether we're successful on a development in Brooklyn Park where we've actually got, you know, we've got some market rate units, we've got some tax credit regular units, we've got 30% units, we've got Section 811, you know. So speaking of a mixed income development, that's actually doable. It's going to be complicated, but it's actually what the city wanted. You know, the city was looking for some market rate housing that could, you know, serve a student population, looking for family units that were affordable, and were supportive of the supportive housing piece of it, the very low income units. And so in particular, this one just happened to kind of come together and work really well, we think, as a mix, as a true, really true mixed income development. So they certainly are, you certainly can do it. It's easier to do affordable mixed with really affordable, just because the funding sources are set up to work that way much better. But if you kind of get creative and you get that again, that village involved in supporting it financially, you can do it. And again, even those, the market rate units in that particular building aren't market like what you would think of as market rate units. You know, that it's 12 units out of 70 that are market rate. And so those rents can't be, you know, $3,000 when the other ones are $1,000. They can be $1,500. So even the market rate ones are affordable. Let's say more affordable than what a market rate development would be. So it's tricky, but it certainly can be done.
Yeah, I would just bounce off of what Jeff just mentioned. We're doing 2 mixed income projects right now that are kind of the base of the vast majority of the units are market rate. And then in our project in South Minneapolis at Lake and Hiawatha, just east of that, you know, the parking lot of the old Rainbow there, which actually burned down in the riots and fires, and we've rebuilt and delivered back to market. 20% of those units are set at 60% of area median income, and then the balance of them are at market rate. And market rate in that neighborhood is kind of 75 to 85% roughly of area median income. And so we're going after a non-luxury demographic with the market rate units, and then a more affordable demographic with that 60% AMI income level. And those 38 units that are set at 60% are in the 4D program of the city of Minneapolis. I think we might have been the first or second project, new construction, that is doing the 4D election within the city that allows us to have those units specifically taxed at the 4D tax rate as opposed to the market rate tax rate, which is a benefit, a modest benefit effectively on the tax side. And it's an opportunity zone funded deal. And so there's other kind of cheaper equity that's coming into it. But it's a non-subsidy project otherwise, which I think was certainly a win from the city's perspective for us to be able to deliver a bunch of units. And then the project out that we're doing out on in Minnetonka in the Shady Oak Park is a 223 unit project, and that's, I think 70% of those units are at market rate, and they're going to probably float around 85%, we think, or 80% or so. And then there's 20%, 10% at 50, and I think the 20% at 80% AMI for 10 years. And there was a modest amount of TIF that went into that deal from the city of Minnetonka, and they were a great partner with us on that. And they really were pushing hard for that 50% AMI affordability in that project. It did make the financing a little bit more complicated, more challenging on the equity and the debt side. But Jeff talked about layering in affordability and tax credits in with market rate. That is not for the faint of heart. We've looked at that structure a couple of different ways, and we've watched a couple of other developers in town try to do that, and it is a lot of lawyers and can add quite a bit of cost. I don't know if Jeff was able to just smooth dog his way through that or not, but that's difficult. It can be done more frequently when you separate the units into different buildings, and so it's a platable, separated title work, and it just makes everybody a little bit more comfortable on the lending side and the equity side. And so there are models for it. It's not as easy and simple for dummies like me to be able to get those projects across the line.
I think too, I always have to go into sort of that definitions mode when we're talking about mixed income, because at least typically the way these things work, you have different actual amounts of rent based on how many bedrooms is the unit, and so we've seen recently some of the new 100% market rate rental communities where the 1 bedroom or SRO units actually have 60% rents. But so much of the demand and the need in the affordable housing spectrum is for larger units for, families with kids, so getting a bunch of SROs or 1 bedroom units at 60%, that really just meets such a small portion of your affordable housing need. I think then, also we have to recognize that tax credit rents are I think, more expensive than people know that they are. And sometimes we'll be at a neighborhood meeting and you put that slide up on the screen saying it's a 60% deal, and here are some of the rents that go up to like $1,400 a month based on the unit size, and people can be really surprised, like, oh wow, my mortgage is less than that, or that kind of comment. So I do think that when you're talking about mixed income, I like how Jeff put it. Sort of there's when you can have the affordable and then the really affordable. One of the things that we saw with our latest Dominion project that we just had a financing closing for last month, they took this new income averaging approach that the IRS is allowing. So in order to get the bonds, so I mentioned we had to apply 7 times to the state to get the bonds. We finally, in order to get the bonds, had to agree on a 50% of AMI project. But then they did this income averaging thing. So like a third of the units are actually serving 40% of AMI. And now some of the units get to go up to 60% instead of all being at 50. But so that's kind of a little bit of a tweaking here and there. I just mentioned that because this is a project where I think we're going to end up getting something like 75 units that are serving 40% households. And but for that income averaging technique, I don't know that Woodbury would have we certainly wouldn't have an easy time getting that many 40% units. So I guess I'm just trying to say if people are looking at tax credit deals, it's a new tool to consider talking with your developer partner about that income averaging approach.
No, and I think for the CDA, the answer is probably going to look quite a bit different when you talk about mixed finance, because the CDA doesn't do market rates. So mixed finance to us would really be all different levels of affordability. And it looks a lot different to us because we're the Housing and Redevelopment Authority for the county. So, you know, for us, persuading decision makers really is more about our partnerships we have at both the county and the city level. So we spend a lot of time presenting to our city planning commissions and our city councils. We make ourselves available to them and to the staff, whether it's a project the CDA is working on or another developer. And so an example of this in 2021, we participated in an affordable housing work session, both with the city of Carver and with the city of Victoria. And that was with both, they were joint with the planning commissions and the city council. And then additionally, right now, the CDA is leading a goal in the county's community health improvement plan that is specific to affordable housing. And so this group, we've developed a PowerPoint around the need for affordable housing in Carver County and then within our cities. And that's something we've just started presenting, and that we'll be presenting to cities and this larger county group, but then also just like community organizations to really get community members to understand affordable housing and the need and what it means. So it's just for us, an important strategy is to maintain our relationships with our city and county partners and community partners really in general.
That sounds like a presentation that would be useful to a lot of groups around the metro, probably. You've done a lot of work. I'm sure that serves not only you, but many in your community. I have a kind of big, hefty final question. And anybody who's listening in, feel free to drop more questions in the Q&A that's open throughout the Teams platform. But I think our final question might kind of take us a good amount of time. So I want to start heading there before we get too close to the end of our time. Something that I've observed is that more and more communities around our metro are electing councils that support affordable housing. And there's starting to be a transition of, you know, not necessarily the most difficult part of building affordable housing is building the political consensus, but rather it's a transition into practices and adopting more supportive local policies for affordable housing. So as more communities are getting into the space of affordable housing in earnest and with a lot of political support, what advice do you have for our attendees who might just be getting started in this work?
Well,
I'll take.
Go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead. I'll go after you're done.
All right. You know, I think it's to me, a lot of it comes down to that consistency in your planning. And I really encourage folks that are new to affordable housing to try to work with your city manager and your council members to figure out, you know, can you find 2 or 3 workshop sessions over the course of 12, 16, 18 months to really put together an intentional approach to how are you going to do this. And I think everyone on this call is probably in the metro. From a city perspective, you know, we're required to guide a certain amount of land for affordable housing. We have, you know, housing chapters with, identified needs for housing affordability. So I think that you can build off of that comp plan and do some policy work. And what I've always found is when you do your policy work well, that then sets you up for implementation. And you know, it's going to add a year to your process. It's not going to result in a new building, coming out of the ground next month. But again, I think it really goes back to that policy work. And if you can have some adopted, you call it a housing action plan or whatever you want, but if you can work through a council process to get an actual plan, then when it comes time to implement, you are going to have more buy-in, and you're probably going to have some agreement on what does success look like and what are the definitions.
Well, and so maybe to piggyback off what Carl said from the perspective of the developer on the other side, I think everything he's saying is so true. But then when you're the developer, like really knowing like this community health improvement plan group we're talking about, like we go back so many times to what's the city's comp plan, what's their vision for their community, like what does their comp plan say about of affordable housing? Do they have a strategic plan or an action plan where they're actively trying to implement it? You know, and you know, for me to say, you know, have a relationship with the city council is probably a little maybe different than a traditional private developer, but have a relationship with city staff, like learn from your city staff, like what is the council's appetite, like what are they talking about, how can you, you know, how can you possibly influence what they're talking about. And, you know, I would say for city staff, learn from what other cities are doing. Like we've got some amazing things. One of the things that was successful in us getting Trails Edge South developed was the city of Waconia implemented a water and sewer trunk fee waiver program. And now we have, and then another city adopted that, and then we have another city looking at it. Like what are some of those big tools in your toolbox as a city that will allow you to help get affordable housing developed in your community?
But sorry, Dave. So, I'd like to just make a comment that how pleasant it is to hear the problem of too many council members and planning commission members being acceptable of affordable housing. You know, I think in general, and I might be just too old and set in my ways, but in the early 2000s, it was a pretty difficult thing to do this type of work, and before. And I would say, you know, with leading cities like Woodbury and Maple Grove that kind of took their role as providing the services to their residents seriously, and they wanted employers in their city and to support all of the infrastructure that built a community. With their examples, way back in the early days, many more communities have kind of jumped on board that wagon, and it's really it makes it so much easier for city staff and developers to approach the idea of affordable housing, to even talk about it in the first place. And so, you know, great news that more people are interested in it. And, you know, how do you keep that interest, or how do you guide them out, kind of leave that to the city folks on the panel or the government folks. But yeah, it's going to take time. It's going to take meetings. You know, for example, feel free to call a developer and say, you know what, we're talking about housing. We're talking about affordable housing. We're going to have a workshop. Would you be willing to come? And for sure, they will. So don't be afraid to reach out to the development community about all of this stuff, and use that education tool with your city leaders.
And just to amplify that point, Jeff, you know, I think what we're seeing a lot is that, you know, council members or city representation are getting elected and have, you know, affordable housing as a piece of the platform, or as something that has engendered a very significant response from the electorate, and is maybe a big reason why that council member or representative got elected. And what we're seeing, frankly, is that there's a lot of energy around affordable housing because it's become kind of one of these hot button political issues, and kind of widely understood as a major need in the Twin Cities as well as around the country. But there's a gap between kind of the political energy of we need affordable housing and what it actually takes to build affordable housing. And that gap in understanding is sometimes very difficult to bridge. There's a level of sophistication and communication that is needed. And so we have attempted to try to help with that understanding gulf, so that elected officials are armed with more information and a deeper understanding of what it actually takes, and the process and the length of the process and the iterations that occur and the bumps and bruises that every project gets on its way to, you know, closing and being delivered. And frankly, arming those elected officials with that information, and then hopefully they're investing with staff to be able to get a deeper understanding of how affordable housing actually works, to make it more of a public infrastructure and that deep institutional knowledge that is needed for the public agencies to be a participant in developing more of this public housing infrastructure or affordable housing infrastructure. And so I would echo Jeff's point to, if there are questions or if there's a need for a general education, like 101, what is affordable housing, what does it look like, how do projects get built, what are the big risks, what are affordable housing developers thinking about, what are what problems are they trying to solve for when they're looking at a project or looking at a site. Those are conversations that we're happy to have, and sounds like Jeff's happy to have. I know other affordable housing developers feel very passionate about what they're doing and are happy to try to explain and communicate and try to build understanding around what that work actually looks like.
Can I just jump in too? I think one of the things that both Jeff and Dave have gotten at is something that we really internalize quite a bit at Woodbury. That housing is economic development, period. And I think that when I look at, Jeff was talking about back in the late 90s when Woodbury was kind of getting going with affordable housing. Part of why we were successful then, as well as today, was that component of the labor shed. And that Woodbury, for a long time, our economic development approach has been to have this three-legged stool: places to live, places to work, places to shop. And all three of those legs of the stool need to work. One of the things we're facing right now is, in certain subsectors economically, you don't have the labor shed for the jobs. And so in order to have a successful retail and office and industrial market, you need to have a successful labor shed. And one of the ways you can improve your labor shed is to diversify your housing base. So I just think that for, communities are maybe a little bit on the newer side for building affordable housing and making those investments. I think if you tie and connect the need to have as diverse of a housing stock as possible to fill the jobs in your community, that can also be very helpful. I know I've been, because I do the economic development work at the city as well as the housing stuff. And, when you meet with a site selector looking at sites, they want to know, do you have workers within a 30-minute drive shed that are going to come to this building and work at my company? And you have to be able to demonstrate that you do. So I just think, again, it's that sort of housing is economic development. And I think sometimes people don't connect that together. But having as diverse of a housing stock as possible is going to make your job scene and your commercial scene stronger.
I really appreciate that type of connection that might not pop to mind for everybody who hasn't made that point before, Carl. Throughout this panel, you guys have shared different ways that you have persuaded decision makers and overcome opposition. You've talked about framing the question and who benefits from the project. You've talked about starting with data and the needs in the community. Is there anything else related to persuasion or overcoming opposition that you would like to share that you think might be helpful for communities just starting to get into this work?
Examples. We've talked about having, Woodbury's got 3 projects with Duffy Development. We learned from each of the previous development how to make the next one better, to the point where I would take Sienna Ridge, which is Jeff's 3rd project, and I would put that against any market rate or affordable townhome project in Minnesota and say it's the best from a design perspective, from a layout perspective. And I really do believe that when you have the ability to have those examples, say, hey, you know what, go drive by this address or that building, and that's going to help sell what you're trying to deliver.
Could I add to that? So perfect. Just to go on top of that, the first development was done in the year 2000, let's say, massive opposition, hard fight at the city council, staff, stood up strong. The second development was done 3 years later, there was opposition, but there was nowhere near the opposition that happened in the first development. The third development happened 4 years later. Nobody showed up. Nobody even made an attempt to, communicate with, at least at the meetings or with us. And so I think it just goes to show that take that first step, be committed to that first step and be strong in that commitment. And once that development is built and running and nobody pays any attention to it, there's your first example of this is what it looks like. And I would also add to that one of the selling points that we make is management of the property after it's built. The building part is really a very short term. Well, it's not, but a couple 3 years. It is the short part of it. And then the management is the thing that goes on for 30 plus years. And at least in Duffy Development's case, we're the management company and the owners, and we can point back to developments that were done, in the early 90s and say, go take a look at that development and see what it looks like. That's affordable housing, how it was in the 90s. See how it looks now 30 years later. We still own it. We're still the owner. And so that's kind of one of our selling points for trying to bring people along and having them do a little background work on us.
Thank you so much, panel, for all of your answers. Just as we have a little bit of moments before closing, if there's anything else you'd like to share that you think is important or parting words you'd like to leave with our attendees, I open this time for you now.
I'll maybe finish where I started, and it's, back to the basics: communication, trust, talk to people, meet with people. Don't rely on, the war of emails. Just communicate authentically and openly and provide context.
Jeff, I think you're still muted. If you were trying to.
Sorry. I was just going to say to tell everybody, thanks for having an interest. We do this stuff every day, and not everybody does, and it's complicated. And to come in and learn a little bit about what's going on out there with affordable housing, I think is going to help, all of us in our communities as a whole. So thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I concur. I think it's a great event for us to be able to share some of our comments and ideas and purview. I think it's really great to see that there's so much attention in trying to build affordable housing in a variety of different and disparate communities, and hopefully we get to work with you all.
No, just thanks for having us. Thanks, Hillary, for moderating.
Yeah. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our panel discussion today, and especially thanks to David, Jeff, Carl, and Allison for working with us through the technical difficulties on the other side of this presentation and bringing such an open and honest candor to kind of a heavy topic. So thank you, everyone. See you next time.